The woman had just returned home when she sensed something was terribly wrong. Her two children were sitting by the window, completely still. Their eyes did not move. And when she finally understood what she was looking at, her legs gave out beneath her. Their bodies were gone, and only their heads remained on the windowsill. Far away from the city on a lonely mountain, Capra lived with her three sons. Life there was simple. The two older boys, Meek and Mihaloshu, were playful and often troublesome, while the youngest Mare was quiet, obedient, and far more mature than his years. For a long time they managed to live peacefully, but one careless mistake changed everything. The older boys accidentally set fire to the grain storehouse. Capra tried desperately to save what she could, but the flames swallowed their food supply. Even after the disaster, Mick and Mialochu showed little regret and continued picking on Mare. Capra scolded them harshly, and eventually they lowered their heads in shame. Still, she swallowed her frustration and sent them to bed, trying to hold her family together. One day, while the boys went up the mountain to play, Capra stayed home to cook. That was when an unwelcome visitor arrived. It was Lupul, a hunter from the mountains and the boys' godfather. He had once been a friend of Capra's late husband. Since she became a widow, he had visited more and more often, and his intentions were never innocent. Capra knew exactly what he wanted, and she always refused him. All she cared about was raising her children in peace. But Lupul would not take no for an answer. He claimed he would never harm the boys, yet he hinted that loneliness could drive a man to madness. Before leaving, he warned her that they would meet again soon. This time, he even tried to force his way inside her home. Furious, Capra said something reckless. She told him she would only consider being with him if her children disappeared. It was a sentence spoken in anger, but one that would soon haunt her. That night during dinner, Capra explained that since the granary had burned down, she would need to go into town the next day to buy food. She told the boys to stay inside and guard the house carefully. She promised to return before nightfall. Later, as the children prepared for bed, Capra remained under the dim light of a lamp. Working with wool she hoped to trade for supplies. The boys, still restless, begged her for a bedtime story. So she began telling them a familiar tale, The Goat and Her Three Kids, a story about a mother goat struggling to protect her little ones from a hungry wolf. What she did not know was that Lupul was outside, listening to every word. This is the goat and her three kids. In the middle of the night, Mare got up to use the toilet. Lupul quickly hid behind a wooden shed, watching silently. Mare noticed nothing unusual. He carried his lantern back to his room and returned to bed, unaware that danger was already circling their home. Early the next morning before leaving for town, Capra reminded her three sons to keep the door locked no matter what, unless they clearly heard her voice. The boys agreed without hesitation. She then set off with her cart, disappearing slowly into the thick morning fog. Mare stood there watching until she was no longer in sight, then carefully slid the bolt into place. But the promise did not last long. As soon as their mother was gone, Meek and Mialotsiu went back to teasing Mare. To avoid them, Mare climbed up onto the roof beams, putting some distance between himself and his brothers. Then out of nowhere, a strange sound came from outside the house.
Pache?
The boys immediately stopped arguing and gathered by the window. Someone was whistling a tune. It was the exact same melody their mother had been singing before she left. The older brothers were convinced it had to be her. Mare, however, felt uneasy. He insisted they could not open the door unless they heard her actual voice. He even mentioned seeing suspicious figures on the mountain the day before. But Mick brushed off his concerns, arguing that no one else would be out there humming that song. Annoyed by Mare's persistence, he pushed him aside and unlatched the door. The moment the door opened, they realized their mistake. It was not their mother standing outside. It was Lupul. At first, Mick moved as if to greet him, but he froze when he saw Lupul reaching for a dagger. Panic set in. Mick tried to slam the door shut, but he was no match for a grown man. Lupul forced his way in, grabbed Mick from behind the door, and threw him to the ground effortlessly. Mare, who had quickly hidden under the stove, watched in horror as his brother lay motionless. Every instinct told him to scream, but fear kept him silent. Once Lupul moved deeper into the house, Mare quietly crept toward the door. That was when he realized Lupul had locked it from the outside. Any attempt to open it would make noise. Inside the bedroom, Lupul heard a faint sound and turned around. He had been handling Capra's clothing, inhaling their scent. As he stepped forward, his boot landed in a puddle. Milociu had lost control in his terror and was trembling beneath the feeding trough. Lupul dragged his dagger across the floor, creating a sharp scraping sound that echoed through the room. Milociu tried to retreat into the corner, but Lupul caught his ankle. The blade sliced through his boot, and his cry of pain filled the house. A sudden noise came from the door, as if someone was trying to unlock it. Lupul moved quickly. He wiped his dagger clean and went to check. At first, he assumed Mare had escaped, but the faint creaking of the wooden floor told him the youngest was still inside. He began searching every corner. His eyes landed on the stove, then scanned the room. There was no one under the table. The only remaining hiding place was the narrow chimney. He tried reaching inside, but the space was too tight for his large frame. He could not squeeze in. Still, he was not satisfied. He stepped outside, grabbed an iron axe, and returned while softly humming the same familiar tune. Without hesitation, he began striking Milociu again and again. The violence left blood splattered across the wall, and even the cross hanging there. Hidden inside the chimney, Mare covered his ears, trying to block out the sounds. He stayed there until everything fell silent, and Lupul finally left, carrying the two bodies away. Only then did Mare climb down. The house was in ruins. Blood covered the floor. The silence was heavier than anything he had ever known. The shock overwhelmed him, and he collapsed onto the ground, losing consciousness. By the time the sun set, Capra finally made her way back home, carrying her supplies. But before she even reached the door, she froze. Something was terribly wrong. The sight in front of her made her stumble, and she collapsed to the ground with a cry of pure agony. Inside, Mare heard his mother's voice. Slowly, he dragged himself to the door and unlocked it. The moment Capra saw that Mare was still alive, she rushed forward and pulled him tightly into her arms. Then she noticed the blood. Following the dark trail across the floor, she was led to the scene she had feared most. Fighting back tears, she demanded to know what had happened. Through sobs, Mare explained everything. A strange whistling sound had drawn his brothers to the door. They ignored his warning. They opened it on their own. When Lupul forced his way inside, Mick tried to hide behind the door. Milociu hid under the feeding trough, but both were caught. Only Mare survived because he had squeezed himself into the chimney. Hearing the name of the man responsible shattered whatever strength Capra had left. She had rejected him countless times, but she never imagined he would answer with something so monstrous. Her hands trembled as she reached for something resting on the windowsill. The tragedy that had unfolded in her home broke something deep inside her. The faith she once held on to slipped away. She tore the cross from the wall and spent the entire night scrubbing blood from the surfaces. When she finally finished the wall, she carried Mare back to bed, then returned to clean the floor. Exhausted from terror, Mare eventually fell asleep, but his rest was far from peaceful. In the darkness of the night, he suddenly woke to the sound of a stone striking the floor. The house creaked in the silence. He called out for his mother, but another stone answered him. Just as he was about to climb out of bed, he heard the unmistakable voice of Lupul calling for him, echoing like something not of this world. Mare jolted awake again, realizing it had been a nightmare, and immediately crawled into his mother's arms. From that day forward, he could not even walk to the bathroom alone. Capra stood guard every time. When he returned, she wrapped her cloak around him and held him close. The peaceful life they once knew was gone. Every piece of clothing, every familiar object reminded her of the son she had lost. Grief slowly turned into rage. Capra knew she could not face Lupul through force alone. He was stronger, bigger, and merciless. If she wanted justice, she would have to be patient. She began preparing carefully. First, she gathered what little food remained and started planning a feast. The invitation would be for Lupul. But this would not be a memorial. It would be a trap. She collected firewood from the forest and worked through the night, shaving down one leg of a wooden stool. It had to be precise. If it was too thick, it would never break. If it was too thin, it would snap too soon. Every movement was steady and deliberate. Her grief had sharpened her focus. Mare could not understand what she was doing. This was the same mother who had always spoken about faith, patience, and leaving judgment to God. Now she seemed different. When he questioned her, she offered only a quiet explanation that sometimes a person must rely on themselves. As she drove a sharp knife into the stool, her anger was unmistakable. If Lupul ever stepped into that house again, he would not leave alive. After making sure Mare was in bed, Capra stepped outside and began digging. She worked through the night, driven by anger that refused to let her rest. By the time the first light of dawn touched the mountain, the trap was ready. She covered the pit carefully with a clean carpet, arranged the table with polished cutlery, and checked the pot of soup one last time. Everything had to look perfect. Before leaving, she reminded Mare to stay inside and obey her instructions. Then she wrapped her headscarf tightly and followed the faint trail of blood down the mountain. At first, the path was clear, but deeper into the forest, fallen leaves and cracks in the ground swallowed the stains. For a moment, she thought she had lost it. Then she heard the crows. Their cries echoed from somewhere ahead. Crows circle where death lingers. Capra followed the sound, and soon she found what she was looking for. There, near a rough camp beneath the trees, the ground was marked with dark, dried blood. The sight made her eyes fill with tears, but the grief only hardened her resolve. Lupul was asleep against a large tree when the sound of her footsteps stirred him. He looked up and saw her standing on the hillside. Quickly, he adjusted himself and tried to appear composed. Capra approached calmly, hiding every ounce of hatred behind a mask of quiet sorrow. She told him she planned to hold a memorial feast for her sons. As their godfather, it was only right that he attend. Lupul agreed without hesitation. He showed no sign of guilt, only a thin confidence that made her blood run cold. Capra did not linger. She turned and walked back home, knowing he would follow. Later, Mare had nearly drifted off while sitting by the window when he suddenly saw Lupul outside. Fear tightened his chest. But then he heard his mother's voice at the door, steady and reassuring. He opened it carefully. Lupul stepped inside, scanning the room. The table was beautifully set, the food laid out generously. Everything seemed in order, except for one detail. There were no other guests. Capra guided him to a seat and casually explained that the others were on their way. Surrounded by food and drink, Lupul quickly relaxed. She poured him wine again and again, watching him carefully. At one point, he leaned back in his chair. The weakened legs shifted slightly, but it did not collapse. Capra felt a flicker of anxiety. The trap had to work at the right moment. Lupul continued eating, drinking, and staring at her with a growing boldness. At last, Lupul gave in to his impulses and grabbed Capra, pulling her into his arms. She fought back with everything she had. As they struggled, the weakened leg of the chair shifted slightly beneath him. He tightened his grip, refusing to let her go. Then Mare's voice came from behind them. He stepped out of the kitchen, holding a ladle in trembling hands. The sight of the boy made Lupul pause just long enough for Capra to slip free. Mare stood frozen, terrified, especially when Lupul's attention turned fully toward him. The question about where he had been hiding carried a darker meaning. Mare's fear silenced him completely. Lupul moved toward the boy, ready to seize him. Capra rushed forward and pulled Mare back into her arms. In that moment of movement and tension, something shifted beneath Lupul's weight. A sharp cracking sound echoed through the room. The weakened chair leg finally gave way. Lupul reached out desperately for support, but there was nothing to grab. The carpet beneath him collapsed, and he plunged straight down into the hidden pit. Beneath the floor was a hollow filled with oily soil and dry wool branches prepared to burn quickly. For a second, there was only stunned silence. Then Capra struck a match. The flames erupted almost instantly. Fire wrapped around Lupul as his clothes caught and fed the blaze. His screams filled the house. Mare clung to his mother, shaking, but Capra did not step back. Every time Lupul tried to claw his way up, she forced him back down. The years of restraint, the grief, the rage all poured out of her. She shouted as the fire roared, condemning him for what he had done to her children. But she did not let him die quickly. She threw hay over the pit, controlling the flames so he would not burn away in an instant. The fire scorched him, leaving his body twisted and disfigured. His cries weakened as he begged for relief. Capra stood there, tears streaming down her face, wondering if her sons had felt the same terror and helplessness in their final moments. Finally, she picked up a heavy stone from the ground. Without hesitation, she hurled it into the pit. This time there was no movement, no sound. Lupul was dead. So the moral of the story is sometimes one careless sentence, one ignored warning, and one selfish desire can destroy an entire family, and no amount of revenge can ever bring back the love that was lost.